The Crusaders were not irrational mobs driven by blind rage. Psychologically, they were ordinary people operating inside an extraordinary belief system. To understand their mindset, we must examine how faith, fear, honor, identity, and authority combined to override moral hesitation and normalize extreme violence. This was not chaos, it was structured conviction. At the psychological center of the Crusader mindset was sacred justification, a process that transformed violence from a moral violation into a moral obligation. The Church did not merely permit violence, it redefined it. By declaring the Crusades a holy mission, religious authority reframed killing as an act of devotion rather than aggression. This reframing activated moral licensing, a psychological mechanism where individuals feel justified committing actions they would normally consider wrong because they believe those actions serve a higher good. Once violence was sanctified, personal ethical boundaries lost their authority. The Crusader no longer evaluated actions by human morality, but by perceived divine approval. This mental shift had profound consequences. When wrongdoing is reclassified as righteousness, internal resistance disappears. The Crusader did not experience himself as choosing violence. He experienced himself as fulfilling duty. Responsibility moved away from the individual and toward God's will, as interpreted by religious leaders. Psychologically, this removed guilt and replaced it with certainty. The more extreme the action, the stronger the proof of loyalty. In this way, sacred justification did not merely allow violence, it demanded commitment, turning obedience into a measure of faith and brutality into evidence of righteousness. Medieval life was shaped by constant uncertainty. Disease, famine, war, and sudden death were ordinary experiences. Psychologically, this created a deep existential anxiety, especially surrounding the afterlife. The fear of dying in sin and facing eternal punishment dominated the moral imagination of the time. The Crusades offered a rare psychological solution: certainty. Participation came with the promise of forgiveness of sins and guaranteed salvation. This transformed fear into motivation. The Crusader was not merely fighting an external enemy, he was fighting internal dread about his own spiritual fate. This assurance fundamentally altered risk perception. When death is framed as a doorway to eternal reward rather than a loss, the instinct for self-preservation weakens. Psychologically, this produces heightened willingness to endure suffering and engage in extreme danger. Pain becomes temporary, sacrifice becomes meaningful, and death becomes purposeful. The Crusade turned anxiety into resolve by offering a clear narrative: suffer now, be saved forever. This mental framework reduced hesitation, suppressed doubt, and made endurance itself a form of psychological relief, because uncertainty had been replaced with promised meaning. Once individuals joined the Crusade, personal identity was rapidly absorbed into a collective one. Psychologically, this is identity fusion, where the boundaries between the self and the group weaken. The Crusader no longer acted primarily as an individual with private doubts, but as part of God's army. This collective identity created emotional safety and moral clarity. Belonging to a divinely favored group reduced uncertainty and reinforced loyalty, especially under hardship. Shared symbols, rituals, and language strengthened cohesion and suppressed internal disagreement. At the same time, this strong in-group identity required a clearly defined out-group. Opponents were framed not simply as enemies, but as threats to divine order. This led to dehumanization, a psychological process that strips others of complexity and moral worth. When the enemy is viewed as evil rather than human, empathy is psychologically disabled. Violence no longer feels personal, it feels corrective. Dehumanization allowed Crusaders to act without emotional conflict, because harm was reframed as purification rather than destruction. Crusader behavior was strongly shaped by obedience to authority, particularly religious authority viewed as divinely sanctioned. In psychological terms, when authority is perceived as absolute and morally infallible, independent judgment weakens. Religious leaders were not seen as interpreters of God's will, but as its direct messengers. This belief structure encouraged psychological submission, where questioning commands felt equivalent to questioning God himself. As a result, moral responsibility was transferred upward, away from the individual. This transfer had a numbing effect on conscience. Actions were no longer evaluated through personal ethical reasoning, but through obedience. The Crusader did not ask whether an act was right or wrong, only whether it was commanded. This reduced internal conflict and made extreme behavior easier to sustain over time. Psychologically, obedience became a coping mechanism. By surrendering judgment, the individual avoided guilt, doubt, and moral fatigue. Authority did not merely guide action, it silenced inner resistance. Medieval European society operated on a rigid honor-based value system, where personal worth was measured through courage, loyalty, and public reputation. Psychologically, honor cultures amplify sensitivity to shame and status. For many men, joining the crusade was not only a spiritual choice but a social one. Participation signaled bravery and devotion, while refusal risked humiliation, suspicion, or moral condemnation. This social environment transformed belief into expectation and expectation into pressure. Under these conditions, hesitation became psychologically costly. Fear of social disgrace often outweighed fear of death. Honor cultures discourage introspection and reward visible commitment, pushing individuals toward risk-taking behavior to prove worth. The crusade provided a stage for validation, where suffering and endurance were interpreted as evidence of character. Psychologically, conformity was reinforced by praise and status, while doubt was punished through exclusion or shame. The result was a system where personal reluctance was overridden by the need to be seen as honorable. As the Crusades unfolded, participants were exposed to sustained violence that conflicted with basic human empathy. This created cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort that arises when actions contradict internal moral values. To reduce this discomfort, the mind does not usually change behavior, it changes belief. Crusaders increasingly justified their actions by strengthening their conviction that the cause was righteous and necessary. The more violence committed, the more essential it became to believe it was justified. Doubt would have meant admitting moral error, which was psychologically intolerable. Over time, this process led to moral hardening. Repeated exposure to violence normalized brutality and reduced emotional sensitivity. Acts that once required justification became routine. This was not due to cruelty alone, but adaptation. Psychologically, escalation became self-protective. Admitting wrongdoing would have shattered identity, faith, and purpose. As a result, belief and behavior reinforced each other in a closed loop. Violence deepened conviction, and conviction legitimized further violence. The Crusaders were not psychologically abnormal. They were ordinary humans functioning within an extraordinary belief system. Their behavior illustrates how structured ideology, authority, group identity, and existential certainty can transform everyday moral reasoning. When obedience to authority replaces personal judgment, when salvation justifies sacrifice, and when honor and group loyalty demand action, ordinary individuals can commit extraordinary acts while believing they are righteous. Psychologically, the Crusades demonstrate the power of context over character. Belief systems can reshape perception, moral evaluation, and emotional response. Actions that would normally provoke guilt or hesitation become meaningful and necessary. Understanding the Crusaders is not an exercise in moral judgment alone. It is a study in how human behavior can be profoundly guided by belief, social structure, and existential reassurance. Their story serves as a cautionary insight. When meaning becomes absolute, even ordinary minds can perform extraordinary violence.